They aren't familiar with the regulatory requirements. They aren't familiar with the technology. They know this is something that we need to do. This is something that agencies around us are doing. Everybody seems to be doing it a little bit differently. We have these missions that we want to complete, but we don't know how to put A, B, and C together to get an operable program.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 176. What's it take for public safety agencies to start a drone program? For that question, we turn to Brendan Stewart, President and Chief Pilot for AeroVista Drone Academy. AeroVista aids public agencies and corporations in empowering the next generation of drone pilots for success. They provide end-to-end solutions beyond just training, ensuring an effective drone program that minimizes risk and maximizes results. Brendan has almost a decade of unmanned aviation experience and over 2,500 flight hours. He is responsible for driving drone training, program development, and FAA compliance solutions for AeroVista Drone Academy. He recognizes that public safety personnel need to be equipped with a turnkey drone program that solves the challenges of FAA compliance, training, scaling operations, producing actionable intelligence, and ultimately accelerates program adoption. In this edition of the Drone Radio Show, Brendan talks about AeroVista Drone Academy, its mission and focus on public safety, and current trends in unmanned training programs. Now, before we hear from Brendan, I want to thank those of you who have been supporting my funding campaign on Patreon. For as little as $1 per month, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to patreon.com/drone radio show to join the team. Now let's learn about drone training programs for public safety organizations with Brendan Stewart. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Brendan to introduce himself.
My name is Brendan Stewart. I'm the president at AeroVista Drone Academy. And what Drone Academy is we are a full service drone program development, flight training, and consulting firm for both public agencies and enterprise clients. So,
Brendan, why did you start AeroVista Drone Academy?
We started Drone Academy back in 2016, before the announcement of the Part 107 regulations. And at that time, we were focused primarily on the flight services vertical. And this was back during the Section 333 days. And one of those biggest challenges of operating during that time is that you needed a Part 61 pilot certificate or a manned pilot certificate to legally fly under the privileges granted by Section 333 exemption. So we're trying to scale our flight services business. And at that time, we built a type training program to train active manned pilots. That's my background. I come from the aviation world, to conduct drone operations to our exacting standards. But we quickly realized that the majority of our attendees were coming from local public safety agencies, which really demonstrated a clear need to us. Once Part 107 was announced, we really pivoted our business to focus entirely on training. And in that pivot, we partnered with the third largest public safety training facility in the United States called the Northern Illinois Public Safety Training Academy, or NIPSTA. We held our first 107 ground school back in July of 2016, and we've since really become the dominant player in the Midwest, providing full service solutions to help public safety agencies and enterprise players join the drone revolution.
Would you characterize AeroVista Drone Academy as a public safety training business? Or is it more of a general training company where public safety is just one of the study areas?
Really, public safety and the larger enterprise adopters. So we've worked with a lot of public safety agencies, both on the local and the state level, but we've also worked with a lot of private sector enterprise players too. We built Uplift Data Partners, a training program for training their pilots to enter the construction vertical. They have extremely high standards for both safety, proficiency, and data management. So we worked really closely with them to develop a training program that now they run and they manage. So we really kind of work in both fields. Our big push right now is public safety because a lot of our public safety clients have needed a little bit more help. There are some significant challenges in public safety that don't really exist in the enterprise market. Obviously, in the enterprise market, it's not life or death, right? So I'd say it's probably 80-20 at this point with public safety and enterprise.
Now, there are a lot of different types of drone training companies. From your perspective, what differentiates your company from the others?
Absolutely. So there's a couple different things, right? The first is we are so much more than just a training company. What we really focus on, and I say training because it gives people a better lens to understand one of the things that we do. Training usually lights up a light bulb in somebody's mind as to what we spend a lot of time on. But we really, as a company, empower public agencies to adopt drones, right? And we do that through a whole host of supporting services because implementing a drone program in public safety is a really big undertaking. A lot of the personnel that are tasked with implementing these drone programs are new to this technology, and it's all of its unique regulatory trappings, right? So the need is apparent, but adoption has been slow. So what we've done is we've developed this comprehensive suite of supporting services that includes both basic training, ground and flight school to get you in the door, operation or mission specific training, right? It's one thing to get your license. It's a different thing to learn how to fly the drone. It's a different thing on top of that to then go use the drone to complete the mission that you intend to complete. We also do a lot of work with agencies from a regulatory compliance perspective, both agencies and companies. Us and our clients were the 4th and 5th companies ever approved for waivers for overflight of people. So we really provide a lot of these supporting services where a lot of other training providers kind of will do 107 training, or they'll do some hands-on flight training, or they might have training specific to a technology or specific to a process. But, we see that frangibility in the marketplace has some challenges, right? And one of those challenges is you might get your license without ever touching a drone. You might learn how to use a technology, but you might not be legal to go fly, right? So what we really focus on is how do we provide a service that gets people up and flying safely, legally, and effectively, doing the types of missions that they intend to do in the shortest amount of time and effort expenditure possible. So that's really how we've developed our model, and it's been working quite well for us.
How do people take the classes?
So there's a couple different options. We have a couple of training facilities here in the Chicagoland area. Usually they're based around public safety training facilities that already exist. We piggyback on their spaces, use their props and that sort of a thing because it's the environment that they're used to training in. It's a protected environment. We also have online courses that are available. For example, the model we built with Uplift is all online. We did a partnership early on with Alan over at UAV Coach and did some online courses with him. We're consistently building out our online presence as well. And for groups that are large enough, depending on the area and depending on the scale of the group, we can also bring training to them. So we're working with a couple of agencies that are at the state level and at the county level where they have enough pilots where it doesn't quite make sense to drive or fly to our training facility. So what we can do is we'll get on the road and take those training programs to them and make sure their pilots are comfortable in their environment, on their location, flying the type of equipment that they're going to fly every day, and make sure that they're really proficient to be able to complete the tasks that they need to go out and do.
What can you tell us about the type of people that come to your programs?
So it depends, right? I think it's a little bit different on the enterprise side than the public safety side. I see a lot of guys in architecture, engineering, construction on the enterprise side that are data guys, right? They understand drones to a degree. They understand the technology, maybe. They understand the data that they intend to collect. And they come into training a little bit more informed. And on a lot of the public safety side, one of the things that we see is, and I see this all the time, somebody will get assigned to develop a drone program and they won't really know where to begin. They aren't familiar with the regulatory requirements. They aren't familiar with the technology. They know this is something that we need to do. This is something that agencies around us are doing. Everybody seems to be doing it a little bit differently. We have these missions that we want to complete, but we don't know how to put A, B, and C together to get an operable program running to allow us to complete these missions. And, importantly, from the public perspective, more than the enterprise perspective, what kind of budget is it going to take to get there? And, how do we make that work in line with budgets that may be squeezed in other areas, that may be squeezed on the training side, that may be squeezed on the equipment side, to get a viable program for which they can show traction and really provide value to their communities.
How do you work with public organizations? What tools do you give them so they can make the case to their administrators, elected officials, and so forth that this is a worthwhile endeavor?
So there's a couple different ways of doing it. The first is, generally speaking, one of the things that we see, especially in the major metro areas, the areas around Chicago, around Indianapolis, we've seen some up in Wisconsin, just in our local geography, one or two agencies will start a drone program in that region. And then all the agencies that surround them will start peeking over the fence and seeing what successes they're having. And one of the things that we do is we work to promote those successes. So we have lots of different webinars that we do pretty regularly. Some of them are available on our website. We do a lot of additional media content. We are rolling out a new additional piece of media called Notes from the Field, where we really go around and do video interviews with UAS coordinators, pilots, folks on the public safety side that are using this technology every day. What's working, what's not working, what type of value are they getting, what do they wish they could be doing, what was easy for them, what was hard for them, to really provide to the community an inside view of here's what's going on, here's why this is valuable, here's why we want to establish one of these programs. That's kind of step one, just getting the information out there, because a lot of people still don't have a clear understanding of what the technology is capable of and what the technology is not capable of. The number two component to that is one of the things that we say, especially with smaller budgets, is we say, look, start a minimally viable program. Start with a Phantom, start with a Mavic, start with something that allows you to get flying, to keep your pilots proficient, to get out there and provide value. Maybe you're on the public works side, you're doing inspections. Maybe you're on the law enforcement side and you're using it just for operational awareness, or you're on the fire side and you're using it just for operational awareness. You don't have to immediately, as you start the program, invest 30 to 60 grand in, multiple Matrix 210s and weeks and weeks of specialized training just to put together a drone program. Sometimes it makes sense to walk before you run. Start with a small program, get one or two pilots trained, get a more entry-level aircraft, get them out building experience, start demonstrating the value on that program, and then use that value demonstration to justify expansion to the program in, additional fiscal years.
Do you provide case studies or lessons learned to help organizations get to the next level?
Exactly. That's one of the things that we do. One of the benefits that we're able to provide kind of in that category is we have a lot of data about what's been working for our students, what type of value they've been seeing in different verticals. So when an agency comes to us and says, hey, we want to start a drone program, but we don't know how to justify it, we've had 50 to 100 students who've just had that problem in the last 90 days, right? So we can go back to their information, help this new agency justify their program, point out neighbors in their vicinity who are already flying. Here's the successes that they've been having. Here was their expenditure. Here's how many pilots they've got trained. Here's how long they've been flying, right? And providing that level of verification allows community stakeholders and those who are responsible for the purse strings, if you will, to kind of understand, okay, this is a real tool. Other people are using this tool. There's real value associated with it. This is not, some guy on the fire department that wants to go out to Best Buy and get paid to figure out how to play with a toy. This is a serious investment in capabilities, and it's actually being used as a tool in these verticals to decrease cost, increase efficiency, increase safety in one of a multitude of operations, depending on what part of public safety you happen to fall into.
I would imagine that public safety organizations that have an air service wing are probably more open to starting a drone program. What's been your experience?
Yeah, we have seen the correlation 100%. One of the first agencies to get up and running with a drone program in the state of Illinois was Illinois State Police, who has a pretty significant air operations wing that operates under public COA, and they have for some time. So having that aviation expertise to understand what does it take to put an aviation program together, because that's really the heavy lifting that has to be done that people don't understand, right? Things that people struggle with are how training should be conducted, how to deal with the FAA, right? Do you want to fly it under public COA? Do you want to fly it under 107? If you want to fly it under 107, what waivers do you need? If you fly it under public COA, what things are considered governmental operations and what things are not considered governmental operations? Really understanding those nuances and understanding what it's going to take in time and, commitment to start an aviation operations program is important. The other thing is, one of the things that we've seen is the most successful UAS programs have a UAS coordinator or a point person that is assigned to manage all of the functional elements of that program. Because there's a lot of moving parts in a functional drone program, right? And one of the things that we recommend is if you have someone that is part of your agency that has an aviation background, I don't care if they're an active pilot, if they were a military pilot long ago, or who have, were an active pilot and are no longer, haven't flown in a couple of years, maybe not biannually current, but they're going to have a much, much better understanding of how the program needs to be scoped. They're probably going to have a much easier time getting their certificate and being among the first iteration of pilots that's able to operate in that program than it is for those who are new to the industry or to the vertical. It's really hard when you go from scratch with no experience in aviation to getting tasked with not only learning how to fly this aircraft, this drone, but then using it to complete a particular mission, and then building a program to train others to do exactly the same thing that you learned 4 to 6 weeks ago, right? So that's really challenging for a lot of people. We try to shorten that learning curve as much as possible, but any aviation expertise is significantly more effective. And the one caveat to that, I would say, is there seems to be, at least in our area, something of a disconnect between the medical helicopter operations and public UAS operations. And we are starting to see more dialogue being opened up. But I've heard some horror stories about some medical helicopter service providers having SOPs that indicated if a drone is detected or reported in the area at all, they have to break off the operation, which, if it's a public safety drone, a trained pilot, a coordinated operation, that pilot's on a radio, there's a communication capability there, that shouldn't need to occur, right? And that lack of coordination, could cause some pretty serious operational issues. So there absolutely is a benefit to make a very long story short, in having that aviation expertise, but more than having that aviation expertise that I think is important is having it and also coordinating effectively between, if you're running both types of programs, the traditional aviation operations program and the UAS operations program, because we might be on the same playing field, so to speak, following very, very similar rules, but the way that we operate and coordinate and think about the world can be a little bit different, especially if you have a drone pilot that is being trained that doesn't have that background.
And that becomes more important when we start talking about emergency operations, whether it's fighting forest fires or hurricanes or whatever, because that's all about coordination and making sure that the designated incident commander understands where the drones are and who's doing what.
Right. Who's doing what? Where are the drones? What can the drones be used for? What can't they be? One of the challenges that we've seen is training has to extend beyond the remote piloting command, the visual observer, the sensor operator, right? Incident command has to know, how do we deploy this asset? What is this asset effective for? One of the things that we've found is, the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, doesn't deal with drones the same way that it deals with aviation operations, because aviation operations under NIMS are flown in from an airport. Drones really can't be. Drones have to work like a ground asset, right? They have to be driven up to an incident and deployed from that location. They can't cover extremely large areas. They're generally localized. So coordination is extremely important. Understanding how the technology is deployed, what its capabilities are, some of the things that might be a little bit beyond its capabilities, so you can most effectively use that asset to complete the needs of a particular mission.
Now, does NIMS specifically mention drones?
So my understanding, and I'm not a public safety guy by training, so this is all things that I've learned from working in the industry with, the subject matter experts that make up our advisory board. My understanding is that it's kind of being adapted, but I don't have very good information on that yet. We're trying to set those standards on a state and national level because there, really haven't been a lot of effective standards for this type of UAS that we fly on a local level. I know that the way that NIMS traditionally treats aviation operations doesn't quite fit with the way that we do it with drones. And this is rapidly evolving. So the information that I may have heard about this might be a little bit old, but that tends to happen in this industry.
Now, in addition to creating this training program, you have several years' experience using drones yourself. Can you tell us about your background and how it evolved?
Sure. My story is pretty interesting. I've always been kind of an aviation geek. I went to school for electrical engineering, and, a lot of the projects that I did back in the day when I was in college, which was not all that long ago, revolved around automation, embedded sensors, that sort of thing. So 5 or 6 years ago, grew up flying model airplanes, really started moving away from the prototyping, testing, and development that we used to do all the way into actual functional conducting operations with drones, right? And when Section 333 came out, I was already a pilot anyway, so I figured this is great. Let's get on board. Let's start flying this stuff commercially and see what type of value that we can provide. So we were one of the early companies to get a Section 333 exemption. I was a Part 61 pilot at the time, so I used to get called up by other exemption holders all over the Midwest to conduct flight operations for them because I was, a qualified pilot. I flew for Fox Chicago. I flew automotive commercials. I did a lot of production work because that's where a lot of the need was, that's where a lot of the demand was at that time. And in that day and age, this is like early to mid 2014, 2015. Hardware was extremely expensive. The reliability wasn't very good. I remember I used to fly this coaxial octorotor, right? So it looks like a traditional quad rotor, but you've got 4 rotors up and 4 rotors down with a $60,000 red cinema camera on it. And I had a director that had us doing this project day in and day out, chasing an L train under Section 333 behind it, right? The elevated trains that we have that go around Chicago, which at that time with that equipment was really extremely challenging. And I'm sweating, right? Because not only do I have my pilot's license on the line, but this aircraft is many orders of magnitude worth more than my car. So back then, really learned a lot about airmanship and pilot proficiency as it relates to drones. And I was really fortunate to get started at that time when the automation wasn't as prevalent as it is today, when the hardware reliability wasn't quite as good as it is today, because it allowed me to build skills and experience that I now teach today that are evidence-based on here's what happens when certain failures occur. Here's how you should be planning your flights, right? Constantly looking for spots where you can make an emergency landing. Here are the type of hardware issues that you should expect to experience in any given day of flying, right? Because there's no airworthiness standard for drones like there is for manned aircraft. So moving into the public safety vertical, one of the big things in public safety is you don't get called on a July afternoon with a beautiful blue sky day and 80-degree weather and 5 miles an hour wind. You get called in the middle of January when the winds are 25 miles an hour and you may have low clouds that are just barely legal, or it might be raining or something like that. You've got to deal with that environment, deal with the functionality of your aircraft, and get as much utility out of it as humanly possible to meet the needs of your mission. And that's one of the things that we take really, really seriously at Drone Academy, is providing an educational experience that's predicated on making pilots as functional, safe, and proficient as possible. Because when we're training these public safety pilots, lives depend on that experience. And that's something that we feel very strongly about promoting.
It's so easy today with the sophistication of the drones for people just to gloss over all of the things that you learned several years ago. How do you feel when you see a new pilot come in and maybe take the position of, well, the drone has got this stuff all figured out?
So we deal with that all the time. I'd say about 80% of the pilots that come through Drone Academy start with that mentality, but they don't leave with it. And one of the reasons that they don't leave with it is because we simulate failures, we disconnect stuff, we turn stuff off, we uncalibrate stuff, we simulate those failures. Just like when I was learning to fly an airplane, my flight instructor would simulate engine failures and turn off avionics and do all sorts of stuff. A lot of those features are great. they make our lives easier, right? They allow me to focus on the mission instead of focusing on keeping the aircraft in a particular location. That makes me infinitely more effective, right? Automation is a force multiplier. It allows me to do more with my brain than I could if I'm using all of my mental effort focusing on the drone. But some of the challenges are it's not foolproof. One of the challenges that happened recently with actually a former student of mine as he was flying on a construction site on actually the Apple campus. He's flying a mapping mission. And the way he recants the story is he's flying an Inspire 1 version 2, right? So no obstacle avoidance. But he's talking to the crane operator, and the crane operator says, well, it's at 280 feet, should not be a problem. So he sets his flight plan for 290 feet to clear it and, hits run. Flies the mission, gets halfway through the mission, notices on his tablet, says aircraft disconnected. He looks up, his Inspire's fallen out of the sky, right? The issue was he didn't verify that altitude of the crane. Turns out it was a little bit over 300 feet. So there are some pieces of, even though the automation was working 100% correctly, there are functions of aeronautical decision-making and procedures that we conduct. There's a procedure that we teach in class called determining MOCA, or minimum obstacle clearance altitude, that would have allowed him to determine the height of that obstacle plus or minus about 10 feet. So there's more to it than just, pressing a button and flying. There's still a lot of flight planning that needs to be done. As aircraft get more automated, they also get more complex. It's about more than just flying the machine. It's about using that machine to complete a particular task safely, maintaining a situational awareness on your environment, making proper decisions in environments where you may only have fractions of a second to make those decisions to be as effective as you possibly can be.
Compare doing business today against a few years ago. As I see it, maybe there were fewer pilots back then, which makes me think you were in high demand and could charge a higher rate. But today there's a lot more competition. How do you see things from a business standpoint over that time?
Man, that's an interesting question. The industry ebbs and flows all the time. Now, I've made a pretty significant switch. I was in flight services at that time. I'm no longer really doing flight services. So I can't exactly speak to what flight services pilots are making, but what I can tell you is one of the real challenges is the industry is still very small, right? We've had 100,000 commercial drone pilots enter the industry. And with that huge influx of pilots, there has not been a congruent rise in adoption of the technology. There's been some rise in adoption, no doubt, right? But it has not risen at the same level as pilots have entered the marketplace. And that's created a lot of anxiety for some pilots that feel, especially on the flight services side, that feel like their breathing room is shrinking, which has led to, all sorts of stuff. Race to the bottom prices. We've seen some unlawful operations. One of the things that's really frustrating to my students is I had a student recently that was flying a commercial production for a Fortune 500 company, was going through the proper airspace authorization process, told the client, this is going to take 4 to 6 weeks to get the FAA to sign us off because we're in controlled airspace. And it turns out they hired some operator for a couple $100 to fly it illegally, right? So some of those challenges are really frustrating. And, we all want to see expansion of opportunities in the industry. But one of the things that I tell students all the time is focus on expanding the pie, not expanding the size of your slice, right? Grow the market in a responsible and sustainable manner. It has gotten harder. The demand curve has shifted, but we feel the momentum and it's, going the right direction and we feel good about it.
You're going to be speaking at Interdrone this year. What will your session be about?
We've got a couple sessions. I'm speaking in 2 different sessions. The first is on how to effectively not just begin your commercial drone operations, right? But how do you scale up the experience curve in commercial drone operations, right? The challenge is you get a bunch of folks in the room. Let's say you want to conduct a construction operation, right? Construction has got a really, really definable ROI. You eliminate rework. Rework's about 30% of the cost of any construction project on average. So there's a huge ROI there. But how do you take pilots that have very, very little experience flying drones, very, very little experience capturing photogrammetry data or processing photogrammetry data? And how do you get them to a position where they're able to generate that ROI as quickly as possible without accidents, errors, or bad data? That's session number one. Session number two is something that we're really excited about. It's about mutual aid in the public safety environment. So we work with a group called MABUS Illinois here in the state of Illinois. MABUS stands for the Mutual Aid Box Alarm System. The way that I explain it to people is MABUS kind of is to firefighting what Delta Force and the Navy SEALs are to the military. They handle the most elite, most challenging, most high-risk types of operations. And they do it on a mutual aid basis. So they get called out to larger geographies. They go places as needed. They sent 700 units to Hurricane Katrina back in the early 2000s. So what we're doing with them is we're working on their work group to build out drone implementation standards and standards of interoperability. So what we'll be talking about in that session is, for public safety agencies that are putting together a drone program, how do you leverage a mutual aid model such that if you're working with a lot of other communities, or you're responsible for fire protection in other communities, or you're interfacing with other communities and working with other communities, emergency management or emergency response teams, how can you set up your drone programs to be interoperable? So if you deploy a pilot from any particular location or any particular locality to a different incident scene, regardless of what particular agency or particular geography they came from, they're trained to the same standard, they're using the same standards of compliance, the equipment's interoperable, spare parts, props, batteries, those are all the same, and you've got effective coverage anywhere that might be needed at any given time. We've been quite fortunate in Illinois to have really developed this mutual aid model. MABUS has been doing this since the late 1960s, and we really think we've got it down to a science. So we're just applying that to drones and all of the trappings of the complexity that comes along with aviation training in the regulatory environment.
Who do you think these sessions will appeal to?
So the first session, scaling up your team, is more on the enterprise side. We expect to see a lot of folks there from construction, inspection verticals, really the heavy-duty enterprise side, who are putting together internal teams. On the public safety side, I obviously expect to see mostly public safety personnel or folks that are looking to start drone programs for or with public safety agencies, especially in areas where you've got a lot of population density, you've got a lot of agencies that are working closely together to set those standards, to make sure that everybody's working on the same page of an evidence-based standard to the same level of functionality and efficacy.
Getting back to your own experience with drones, what have the last few years taught you about the industry?
A lot of things. I don't know if I could sum that up really into one cogent statement, right? But I think now more than ever, what I've seen is we as an industry need to support each other, establish clear evidence-based standards, and collaborate when it benefits both the companies that are involved as well as the industry as a whole, in order to survive and thrive and grow the industry, right? Like I said earlier, there's over 100,000 commercial drone pilots that have entered the marketplace, all kind of at once, 50,000 pilots a year since 107 was passed. And the level of influx has superseded the rate of growth in the marketplace, right? So I think we all want to see the same expansion, but in order to do that, we've got to be good stewards of the industry, really push the market toward maturation. Like I said, instead of focusing on trying to make your company's slice of the pie bigger or your particular slice of the pie bigger, focus on growing the pie, growing the marketplace in general. There's a reason we call it business development, right? We're out evangelizing the solution, talking about what drones can be used for, what verticals are adopting drones, why, what's the ROI that they're experiencing, and really bringing customers on board, adding to the size of the market. And that's one of the messages that I would give to folks that are getting started in this industry, is really focus on, as much as you are building your own company, your own personal brand, your own personal operations, but grow the industry as well.
I want to dig a little deeper into what it takes to build a business today. What other advice would you give people who are trying to create their own business? For
the folks that are building businesses in the drone world, I think that it's extremely important to figure out what problem it is you're solving, right? It all comes down to this simple question that every single entrepreneur should ask themselves every day. I wake up in the morning and ask myself this question every day, all the time. What problem am I solving? I see this in the marketplace, and we've seen it other places as well. Google Glass comes to mind. But like a consistent stream of visionary ideas that fade into obscurity, not because they weren't good ideas or they weren't good solutions, but simply because there wasn't a fundamental roadblock that created the market need for their technology to step in and eliminate. So in simple terms, they didn't really solve any tangible problems. So if you're jumping into this industry, what I'd really recommend is first figure out a problem, right? Identify a problem, a point of inefficiency, something that's not working that you want to solve. Dissect it, make some assumptions about it, learn everything that you can about it. Learn how it's being solved today, learn who's solving it today, develop a prototype based on that learning, test it, refine it, bring it to market, and maybe even pivot. One of the things that we had to do numerous times is change direction. The market ebbs and flows. The drone industry is really in its infancy. Even if you look at Section 333, the industry as a whole has only been around for 5 to 6 years, as we know the commercial industry today, right? So identify that problem, really drill down to understand that problem, create a solution to that problem, and then go out there and market that solution. I see a lot of folks who get into the industry and say, I'm going to fly drones that can do everything. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration is coming from, because it's hard. You can't be an expert in every vertical all the time. So really find a problem, specialize, and nail down that problem, create a solution, and then scale that solution out.
What's it been like for you personally, working in this industry and achieving the success that you have?
Well, working in the drone industry has been an incredible experience. I think, Reid Hoffman, one of the original founders at LinkedIn, said it best. Entrepreneurship is like jumping off a cliff and building an airplane on the way down. There are definitely some terrifying moments. There's a lot of times of celebrating, and there's a lot of times of nail biting. But one thing I know from years of flying airplanes is, as counterintuitive as it may seem, sometimes the best way to build up airspeed is to point your nose at the ground. And while there's definitely some heightened blood pressure around the office now and again, we all trust in the process and feel the momentum building in the marketplace. And it's really exciting to be a part of this industry, especially as it's so young.
And for my final question, Brendan, what message would you like to leave listeners about the future of the drone industry?
To close out, welcome to the ride. This has been an incredible experience to be a part of this industry. It's really cool to watch it ebb and flow every single day. Now, there's 3 major points of advice that I would leave with any of your listeners as to how to go out into the industry and be as effective as possible. Number 1, be a problem solver, right? Find that problem in the industry that you want to solve, develop a solution to it, nail it down, and then pivot as necessary. Number 2, find like-minded people. Identify some thought leaders with a shared vision and values, and work together to propel the industry forward as much as possible. By growing that industry, you grow the opportunities for yourself. And transitioning into that point number 3 that I kind of alluded to, and I say this to my students all the time, especially on the commercial side, is grow the pie, right? The industry is way too small for hardcore direct head-to-head competition. We really want to focus our energies on building this industry up as much as possible. That way we all do better. There are more opportunities. Drones get further out into the marketplace. More people are using them, because that's all what we're excited about at the end of the day, right? Is seeing this technology really come to the forefront of day-to-day operations in a number of verticals, and really having drones become a household item.
That's it for episode 176 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Brendan Stewart of AeroVista Drone Academy. I want to thank Brendan for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about AeroVista Drone Academy or want to connect with Brendan, check out the webpage at aerovistainnovations.com. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1 per month, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to patreon.com/Drone Radio Show. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Gores.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.